Hi, this is Mr. Schneider from Glenwood Springs High School. I'm going to walk you through some things to consider with context and how you set up your evidence. To do that, I'm going to run you through like a possible question just to try to help illustrate why context is so important. So if you're a student in one of my classes, you might remember this from long ago in first semester. For the rest of you, it'll be new. But here's a possible question. Let's say the question is it okay to have a smartphone and use it during school? Well, here's my thesis. My thesis is that smartphones should never be used in school, and their use should be limited in the home as well. Now, I know a lot of you are probably like recoiling at that and wondering, like, oh, I don't know about that. And you're probably getting defensive. So you probably want to know, what's my reason? What's my evidence that I have to back that up? So here's an example of a quote. We limit how much technology our kids use at home. This is a quote that I could use as evidence to try to back up my thesis. Now, you're probably asking yourself, like, well, okay, that's a fine quote that certainly speaks to that thesis, but why does it really matter? And this I think illustrates why context for a quote really does matter. And you might say that the quote helps my thesis, but maybe doesn't really prove it until you see that this is a quote from Steve Jobs, the guy who helped create the iPad and bring out the iPhone, longtime CEO of Apple. It comes from an interview he did where he described how his own children hadn't even used the new iPad because they limit their technology use at home. So there, I just show you, there's a great example, I think, where this quote, going back to it on its own, doesn't maybe have a whole lot of value. Like, it might speak to my thesis, but it doesn't maybe really prove it unless we know who said it and why that person is important. Here's another, and then finally, I would have to give this analysis, right? I would have to provide the analysis to really provide the link to the thesis. Let me give you another example of a quote. You're always looking at how it can be used in a great way, homework and staying in touch with friends, and also where it has gotten to excess. And again, you might look at this quote and say, well, I guess it speaks to the thesis, but why does it really matter? And it's because it's from Bill Gates. And basically, this quote describes how, with their own kids, teenage and older, how they really limited cell phone use, didn't let them have cell phones at all until 14. They banned cell phone use at the dinner table, and so on. Bill Gates is the long time head of Microsoft, really influential in the personal computing revolution. So a pretty key figure. So knowing that quote comes from him gives it a lot more validity, a lot more power to back up my thesis. Here's another quote. Again, it literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. It probably interferes with productivity in weird ways. Same kind of thing. You might think it's not that valuable quote, but it comes from Sean Parker, one of the former Facebook presidents. And so knowing it's from someone who is the president of Facebook gives it a lot more power. Here's a statistic and some evidence perhaps that could be used to back up my thesis about smartphones being really limited in use and never used in school. The effect of banning mobile phones from school premises adds up to the equivalent of an extra week schooling over a pupil's academic year. So after schools banned mobile phones, the test scores of students aged 16 improved by 6.4%. And this is, I think, a piece of evidence that really illustrates how you should probably know who said it. Like, did I do this study, like Mr. Schneider? Did I have my kids do this study? How do you know this study wasn't made up? Like, you could really question the validity of this piece of evidence to back up my thesis unless we know who it came from. And it comes from the Center for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. And so that should give it a lot more validity, that it's a reputable source with a study that was well done. This is my last example here. Um, my last quote: the problem is that social media programmers only care about profit, which is through advertisers via clicks. They don't care about you or your personal development in a positive way. They just want you to get addicted and keep clicking regardless of its value. Now, again, I ask you to consider the value of this quote to prove my thesis. And again, you're probably catching on right now that on its own, this quote probably isn't very valuable because we don't know who said it, right? And it might speak to my thesis, but again, it could have been my mom or my kid or who knows, somebody I met on the street. In this case, it's a guy I went ice climbing with. And you might be thinking like, well, Mr. Schneider, you're not helping your case. And this illustrates why you got to be careful about the context you give. And this quote actually does come from a guy that I went ice climbing with. It's a guy named Chris Daniels that I have guided ice climbing and mountain climbing for a number of years now. So I've gotten to know him really well. And this is something he told me one day when we were out ice climbing. And so you might think, well, okay, Mr. Schneider, that's great. So you know a guy who thinks social media is bad and smartphones are bad. And this guy talks about how his own kids don't have smartphones. But here's who Chris Daniels is. And this illustrates why you have to know who the person is that's saying these quotes. He, to make a long story short, was one of the heads of Facebook. You can see him on this diagram of the Facebook leadership team from a few years ago. And he was the head of Facebook's internet.org and later WhatsApp. And so he actually just quit last year. And when he quit, it was front page news on the Wall Street Journal. It was in the New York Times and all over. It was pretty big news when he quit. And so when he told me this quote, when we were out ice climbing, it was really telling, really interesting. And so on its own, it's not super valuable, but knowing it's from someone who was very much deeply embedded in social media with the use of smartphones, I think it gives it a lot of value. So I really ask you to consider those examples that I give you about how we really need to know the context of the pieces of evidence that we use. Now, a little reminder here. Some of you might be familiar with the Tequil like outline of your essay, with the context, evidence, and analysis being really key. And some really key points to draw out: you need context for your evidence. You need to know, why is your source a reliable or a quality source, right? Like, for example, again, with Chris Daniels, if I just told you he was a guy I went ice climbing with, wouldn't be a very good source. Knowing he was one of the heads of Facebook, oh, that makes it a pretty good source. In the quote setup, you can hint at the quote's significance and its relevance. And then you should also give your reader enough information about the subject so they can understand the quote. Finally, in the analysis, that's where you're going to tell why the quote proves your thesis and provides that link. And so to take a look at your Arab Spring DBQ, let's look at a couple of examples. Here's a great example, I think. I really like this quote because I think it's kind of beautiful in a way. The light from the Arab Spring rose from the ground up. And I think this is a quote that I think speaks to this idea that social media can democratize change, meaning making it so that ordinary people can change the world. Democracy is about getting everyone involved, right? So I like this quote, but I don't know. Colin McCann, he's an Irish writer. I'm not really sure why that's a good source. Well, if we go and look at document 1, maybe it'll help tell us. And Irish writer Colin McCann, a witness to the Arab Spring uprising. Okay, so that gives me a lot better context. The fact that he was a witness to it, presumably as a reporter for the New York Times, he was there witnessing what was happening. And so that kind of firsthand experience can be really valuable. And so having this in your context is really important. Let's look at another example There's this quote here about we will watch, listen, and if we do not like what we see, we will rise again, from a cab driver in document 3. And this is a quote that I've provided in the essay starter outline to back up this idea that knowledge is power, right? And so here, I like this quote because I feel like it speaks to this idea that when people are empowered with knowledge through social media, right? Like I've said here in the thesis here, that it can cause them to rise up, to do something about it. That's very directly what this guy is saying, that we're going to do something about it. But he's a cab driver. So how valuable of a source is that? I mean, where is this cab driver is a really good question, right? Is this a cab driver in Glenwood Springs, in Aspen, in New York City? I mean, the Arab Spring took place in the greater Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East, not in New York City. So let's go to document 3 and see, maybe we need some more context here. So it's a cab driver from inner city Cairo, which is the capital of Egypt. And he said this during the Arab Spring protest and uprising. So that provides a lot more information, a lot more context to help give this quote more validity, more power, right? And so that's what I really want to leave you with. When you use your quotes in your essay, think about, what do you need to tell your reader so that they really understand why this quote is valuable and important, why it has some relevance, and just always think about that. What does your reader need to know? And finally, don't use naked quotes. Just throwing out random quotes there without any context is a definite no-no. So don't use naked quotes. Give us the context. Let us know what we need to know about that quote.